So I want to start off my talk today with a question to you. In doing this, I want you to take time to ground yourself, center your thoughts. Think about your own experiences and aspirations and what this question means to you. My question to you today is, how do you want to change the world? Many of us experience harm and violence on a daily basis, that it forces us to think, what would it look like to completely deconstruct and rebuild society as a whole? And so that's my question to you today. What does it look like to completely transform the world as we know it? Hi, my name is Temwani Nyama, and welcome to my TED Talk. So a bit about me. I am a postgraduate student under the School of Education here at UCT, and a big portion of my work lies at the intersection of social justice and education, particularly in the sense that I am passionate about youth development and social responsiveness, all under the context that is the African education space. A big part of my current studies, professional work, as well as my long-term intentions lies at looking at the ways that we can find teaching and learning practices that enhance African schools and how they practice social imagination, creative thought, and critical knowledge and innovation. Okay, I think you get it by now. Education is my passion. When we look at the history of education in our context, in reference to things like the Bantu education system, or even the history of schooling under imperialism, there's so much evidence that shows us how the schooling system has functioned as a means for enslaved and marginalized people to acquire cultural literacy that makes them function in colonial societies, but never attain equality with colonial powers. When we look at recent events like the Rhodes Must Fall movement, we see that for a long time, the institution of education has been entrenched in systemic powers of coloniality and structural inequality. So much so that writers like Wanelisa Kaga speak about the fact that the education space has become a site of resistance and political mobilization, specifically through the movement of decolonization. Now, decolonization is a very interesting aspect to me, and if you're close to me, you know that it's something that defines who I am. And it's because it's something that I've explored both in its theory as well as in its practice. And something that's interesting about decolonization is the way that it pushes us to find new framings for things like social relations, identity, and knowledge. It forces us to imagine and inquire about alternative worlds, to imagine alternative lives. And so something that has helped me build up this habit and disposition for decolonial inquiry and imagination has been this question. How do we bring decolonial education into the practical teaching and learning in African schools? We've talked about we've talked about the why and what of decolonization, but I think the contemporary moment pushes us to think about the how as well. And so I'm here today to engage, to have a conversation. And I propose that we can bring about this transformation in our schooling system in three main ways. One, through the use of facilitation as a teaching methodology. Two, through the reworking of language education in our subjects. And three, through the initiation of civic education programs in our schools. So to start off, facilitative pedagogies are interesting because they are a method of teaching and learning that emphasize how we exist in the classroom and how we form classroom engagements. And this is something that I've had the opportunity to learn about both in its theory and practice through the UCT Global Citizenship Program. What is interesting about facilitative pedagogies is that they frame teachers as facilitators that hold space for students as participants. And so while the classroom engagement focuses on unpacking and working around disciplinary knowledge, The emphasis is on bringing young people and their perspectives, their experiences, into the process of constructing knowledge through collective and dialogical work. As a result, facilitative pedagogies are valuable because they speak to the ways that we can reform the classroom space as a whole. As a result, facilitation, when it is used as a teaching practice, shifts the dynamic of the classroom from being something that is linear and unidirectional to something that is collective, whole, and a communal process where we construct knowledge together. And so facilitative pedagogies are useful because they speak to decolonial ideas around forming social relations that disrupt the propagation of power. So this is the first way that we can bring about change in teaching and learning in our schools. The next is through reworking language education. Now, it's important that we recognize that language is inherently connected to our identities, histories, and lived realities. And so when we think about language in schools, we need to reframe how we treat language, how we create language and literacy programs for our students. It's important that these become spaces for critical imagination and creative thought. I've had the opportunity to form part of the UCT Language Policy Task Team and to work with research by people like Leketi Makelela. And two main concepts that have come up for me that are important in this concept are multilingualism and translanguaging. Now, these are concepts that speak to the fact that we belong to many worlds. We belong to a number of discourse communities. We draw on many epistemic and linguistic resources in any given moment. And so by reworking language education using multilingualism and translanguaging, it necessitates that we develop teaching practices that mediate how students make fluid alternations in the ways that they produce and receive language in their speaking, reading, and writing. Now, one thing about me, when I'm interested in something, I'm going to find out for myself how it's practiced. And I've had the opportunity to do this through the Jakes Carwell Fellowship, which I'm part of. Now, this is a scholarship and a vocational development program that focuses on crafting young people into expert teachers, educational leaders, and social entrepreneurs. In my third year under the fellowship, I had the opportunity to pilot my own project around how we can transform language education. For my project, I facilitated a workshop with COSA students from Westerford High School here in Newlands. And the workshop focused on getting learners to learn about the fundamental linguistic structure of the Xhosa language. And so we worked through a number of exercises where they learned about this concept of amahlelo. But it didn't just end there. The initiative behind the workshop was to get learners to use this concept as a building block for them to build their own expressions and terms for things that they felt they didn't have the language for. And so through this workshop, learners specifically focused on describing and creating language and words for things and experiences around mental health. What this project emphasized for me was that we need to look at language in a way that it is a resource for creative thought and knowledge. And more than anything, when we think about language in schooling, it's important that we realize that students shouldn't leave their voices behind when they enter the classroom. Finally, the last way that we can bring about decolonial shifts in teaching and learning is through civic education. Now, I've gotten to learn about civic education through a number of organizations, including Activate Change Drivers and Connect Hub. And what is interesting about civic education is that it uses things like activation spaces, design thinking, and problem-based learning to develop young people and their capacities for active citizenship, social justice, and community engagement. What's useful about civic education is that learners are exposed to the systems and challenges that are faced in different contexts, but they're supported in prototyping and implementing relevant solutions to those problems as well. Now, I've gotten the chance to learn about how civic education applies to practical teaching and learning through the UCT Global Citizenship Program again, which earlier this year hosted a course called Social Infrastructures for undergraduate engineering students. What was interesting about this program was that learners were prompted to shift their ideas of society as the built environment to more sensorial ideas about society as the civic and social space. During the program, they learned about the theories and practical knowledge about things like the Cape and its colonial geographies, the embedded histories and memories of apartheid spatiality, as well as the different initiatives that communities are taking to realize spatial justice for themselves. So what makes civic education valuable is that it equips young people with the resources, skills, knowledge, and experiences to become active and agentic problem solvers and innovators to their respective communities. So these are the 3 ways that I propose that we can bring about change in our education system. Like I said, through facilitative pedagogies, through the reworking of language education, and through community engagement and civic education being introduced into our schooling system. But these are 3 of the many ways that we can bring about this change. And my hope is that shifts like these will initiate decolonial turnings in our teaching, our curricula, and our policies in education. And hopefully in the long term, this will work to undo the matrices of power and control and colonialism that have long been entrenched in our schooling system. In talking about decolonial education, we can't forget about teachers themselves. What is the identity of a teacher under the context of decolonial education? How do we define the professionalism of social justice educators? Now, to respond to this question, I will use my own story. So like I said, I am a postgraduate student, and earlier this year I did my teaching practicals at a high school. And on my last day, I got this card from my grade 10 class. And what was interesting was one of the notes that I got here read the following. The student said, "Teacher Temwani," that's what they call me. "The abolitionist teacher is a new one for me. But I hope many more people are going to experience the quiet radicalism." Now, what I didn't expect, first of all, to receive a letter like this, especially not from some 16-year-old who I taught poetry for 8 weeks. But what it emphasized for me, this letter and this message emphasized for me that when we carry activism in our identity as teachers, it's not something that's just abstract or theoretical. It's personal, it's emotional, it's felt. And so this message affirmed and emphasized for me that decolonial education is truly the way that we change the world. Thank you.